Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. Not Horror. If you're ready for a story that'll give you chills, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now, get cozy, relax, and let's begin today's spooky tale. The first time I saw the cabin, it was in an old photograph. My uncle had inherited it from a distant relative and showed me the picture with an offhanded, "You should use it sometime. Get away from the city." At the time, I barely glanced at it. A dark, weathered structure tucked deep in the woods, half buried in snow. I didn't think much of it until a particularly rough New Year's approached, and I found myself craving solitude. The cabin was several hours away from my apartment, the last stretch of the journey a narrow, winding road through dense forest. By the time I arrived, the sky had turned an ominous gray, heavy clouds threatening snow. The cabin looked even older in person. The wooden planks were warped and splintered, and the windows were coated with grime, giving the place a blind, hollow look. But it was quiet, and that was all I wanted. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint smell of damp wood. The furniture was sparse: a creaky bed, a table, and a couple of mismatched chairs. A wood-burning stove sat in one corner, already stocked with firewood. I busied myself cleaning and unpacking, trying not to think about how isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't passed another car for at least an hour. As the day faded into night, the forest outside became a wall of blackness. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, blanketing the ground in silence. I settled in with a book, the fire crackling in the stove, and for a while I felt the tension in my chest ease. Midnight was only a few hours away. A new year, a fresh start. I needed it more than ever. The first knock came just as I was beginning to doze off. It was soft but distinct, 3 slow raps against the front door. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. I grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously to the door. Peering through the small peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. The snowstorm had picked up, wind howling through the trees. Maybe it was just a branch or an animal. I told myself not to be paranoid. But when I opened the door, there were footprints in the snow. They started at the edge of the clearing and stopped directly in front of the cabin. The prints were fresh, the edges crisp, and too large to be from any animal I could think of. "Hello?" I called into the night, my voice trembling. No answer, just the wind and the hiss of snow. I shut the door quickly and locked it, feeling a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone had gotten lost in the storm, but why wouldn't they stay to explain themselves? I double-checked the locks, stoked the fire, and told myself to relax. Another knock. This time, it was louder and more insistent, reverberating through the cabin. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. My pulse hammered in my ears as I crept back to the door. This time, there was a voice. "Let me in." It was a man's voice, calm and even, but it sent chills racing down my spine. Through the peephole, I could make out a figure standing just beyond the porch light. He was tall, his face obscured by shadows and the falling snow. "I need help," he said. "Please." Something about his tone was wrong. Too composed, too rehearsed. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "Are you hurt?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned closer, and in the dim light, I saw his face. It was my face. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The man outside wasn't just similar to me. He was identical. Same features, same scruffy beard, even the same jacket I was wearing. "You have to let me in," he said, his voice sharper now. "There's no time." "What are you?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. His expression twisted into something between anger and desperation. "If you don't let me in, it'll find you instead." "It? What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, a noise came from the woods, a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The man outside stiffened, his head snapping toward the trees. "It's here," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You have to decide. Now." Panic surged through me. I didn't know what to believe. Everything about this felt wrong, surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of heavy footsteps in the snow. The man, my doppelganger, looked back at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Let me in," he begged. "Please." Before I could react, the sound of splintering wood came from the back of the cabin. Something had forced its way inside. The fire flickered, the temperature plummeting as a shadow swept across the room. I turned, my heart hammering, and saw it. A figure made of darkness, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It had no face, just a void where a face should be. The air around it crackled with an unnatural cold, and every instinct in my body screamed to run. The thing moved toward me, its movements unnaturally smooth and deliberate. I backed away, fumbling for the door. The man outside was shouting now, his voice muffled by the storm. The shadow lunged. I barely managed to throw the door open, diving outside into the freezing snow. The man grabbed me, pulling me to my feet. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. We ran, the cold biting into my skin, as the thing burst through the cabin door behind us. It didn't move like a person. It glided, a blur of darkness that devoured everything in its path. We didn't stop until we reached the tree line, my lungs burning from the effort. When I finally turned to look back, the cabin was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, the snow undisturbed as if it had never been there. The man beside me, my twin, my other self, was watching me closely. "You made the right choice," he said, though his tone offered little comfort. "What was that thing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he gave me a sad, almost pitying smile. "You'll find out soon enough." And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone, leaving me alone in the snow. It started with an ordinary journal, a slim, leather-bound book with a faintly floral pattern etched into the cover. I found it at a thrift store while searching for Christmas decoration, tucked away on a dusty shelf between mismatched mugs and a pile of old board games. The journal was pristine, the pages blank and crisp despite its age. On a whim, I bought it, thinking it would be perfect for jotting down thoughts or maybe some New Year's resolutions. I had no idea it would change my life, and not in the way I hoped. New Year's Eve was never a big deal for me. I wasn't much of a party person, and this year, I planned to spend the night alone in my small apartment with a bottle of wine and some cheap takeout. The journal sat on my coffee table, and as midnight approached, I decided to write down a few resolutions. The first one was simple: get fit. I'd been neglecting my health lately, and it felt like a reasonable goal. The second was more ambitious: get promoted at work. My job as a junior designer at an ad agency wasn't exactly fulfilling, and I wanted to prove I could handle more responsibility. The third was personal: find love. I wrote each resolution carefully, the pen gliding smoothly across the paper. As I finished the last one, a strange sensation washed over me, a prickling at the back of my neck like I was being watched. I glanced around the room, but everything was quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Shrugging it off, I closed the journal and went to bed, feeling oddly accomplished. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my boss. It was a long message, filled with praise for my recent work and a proposal for a promotion to senior designer. My heart raced as this was exactly what I wanted, and it had happened so quickly, almost too quickly. Still, I didn't question it. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but over the next few days, the coincidences kept piling up. I'd signed up for a gym membership on a whim, and within a week, I noticed changes in my body. More energy, better posture, even a slight slimming of my waistline. The progress seemed impossibly fast, like my body was skipping steps in the process. Then there was the man I met at a coffee shop. His name was Alex, and we struck up a conversation over our shared frustration with the long line. He was charming, funny, and most importantly, single. By our third date, it felt like we'd known each other forever. Everything I'd written in the journal was coming true, almost like magic. But magic always has a cost. It started with the nightmares, vivid, horrifying dreams of things I couldn't explain. In one, I was running through a forest, chased by a shadowy figure with glowing eyes. In another, I was trapped in a room with walls that seemed to close in on me, the air thick with whispers. I woke up drenched in sweat, the images seared into my mind. Then came the changes in my body. At first, I chalked it up to my new fitness routine, but it wasn't just weight loss or muscle tone. My skin grew unnaturally smooth, almost plastic-like, and my hair began falling out in clumps. One morning, I noticed bruises along my ribs, dark and spreading like ink. I hadn't fallen or bumped into anything, but the marks kept appearing, as if something inside me was trying to break free. Terrified, I turned to the journal. Flipping through its pages, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: faint, ghostly handwriting beneath my own. It was barely visible, like someone had written on the pages long ago, and the ink had faded over time. I held the journal under the light and strained to read the words. They weren't resolutions, they were warnings. Do not trust it. The journal lies. It takes more than it gives. My heart pounded as I flipped to the last page, where my resolutions were written. The words were no longer mine. The handwriting had changed, jagged and frantic, and beneath my original goals, new ones had appeared. Sacrifice what you love. Give it blood. I threw the journal across the room, my hands trembling. What had I done? Over the next few days, things only got worse. Alex stopped responding to my texts, and when I finally confronted him, he looked at me like I was a stranger. "You're not the person I thought you were," he said before walking away. At work, my promotion turned into a nightmare. The projects were endless, the deadlines impossible, and my boss suddenly became cold and demanding. Desperate, I tried to destroy the journal. I tore out the pages, burned them in the sink, and even threw the leather cover into the trash. But the next morning, it was back on my coffee table, completely intact. The journal wanted something from me, and it wouldn't stop until it got it. That night, the bruises on my ribs began to pulse, each throb sending waves of pain through my body. I screamed, collapsing to the floor, as a voice whispered in my ear, "Give it blood." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a way out. Then I remembered the final resolution: find love. Alex. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The journal had given me everything I wanted, but now it wanted me to sacrifice it. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't. Instead, I grabbed the journal and drove to the edge of town, where the river cut through a dense forest. The air was icy, and the water roared beneath the bridge. With all my strength, I hurled the journal into the current, watching as it was swallowed by the darkness. But as I turned to leave, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like something had been ripped out of me. I gasped, clutching at my ribs, and collapsed onto the ground. When I woke up, the journal was in my hand, its pages blank once more. The bruises were gone, my body felt normal, and everything seemed fine. But I knew better. The journal hadn't disappeared. It was waiting for me to write again, and this time, I wasn't sure I could resist. New Year's Eve was always quiet in our small town, the kind of place where people celebrated with family dinners and sparklers in their backyards. I wasn't one for parties, so I decided to spend the night house, sitting for the Mortons. They lived on the edge of town in a sprawling Victorian house that had always felt a little off. But the pay was good, and all I had to do was keep an eye on their cat, Daisy, and make sure the place didn't burn down. The house was old, creaky, and filled with antiques that seemed to watch you as you walked by. I'd been there a few times before, but that night it felt different, heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The Mortons had left earlier that day, their car packed for a weekend getaway. Daisy greeted me at the door with a soft meow, her orange fur glowing in the dim light. I gave her a quick scratch behind the ears and made my way to the living room. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound deafening. I settled into the oversized armchair by the fireplace, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Midnight was hours away, and I figured I'd watch some TV or read a book until then. But as I reached for the remote, Daisy suddenly hissed, her fur standing on end. "What is it, girl?" I asked, glancing around. The room was empty, nothing out of place. But Daisy's eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, her tail twitching in agitation. I followed her gaze to an antique mirror hanging on the wall. The ornate frame was tarnished silver, and the glass was cloudy, distorting the reflection of the room. I stared at it for a moment, unease prickling at my skin. Then I saw it. In the mirror, there was movement, slow, deliberate, like someone was standing just out of sight. But when I turned around, the room was empty. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe the flicker of the fire playing tricks on my eyes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Daisy bolted out of the room, disappearing up the staircase. I called after her, but she didn't come back. Sighing, I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs to find her. The second floor was darker than I expected. The Mortons had drawn all the curtains before leaving, and the only light came from the narrow beam of my flashlight. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with closed doors. "Daisy?" I called softly. My voice echoed back to me, thin and uncertain. I found her in the guest bedroom, crouched under the bed, her eyes glowing in the dim light. She let out a low growl, something I'd never heard from her. I crouched down, trying to coax her out, but she wouldn't budge. Her gaze darted to the open closet door behind me, and a chill ran down my spine. The closet was empty except for a few old coats and a stack of boxes. But as I shone the flashlight inside, the shadows seemed to shift, pooling unnaturally in the corners. For a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale, with hollow eyes, staring back at me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. When I looked again, the face was gone. I grabbed Daisy and hurried back downstairs, slamming the guest room door behind me. Something was wrong with this house, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what. Back in the living room, I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by too many ghost stories and the Mortons' creepy decor. But then the lights began to flicker, the dim glow of the chandelier casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The mirror caught my eye again, and this time, I couldn't look away. The glass was no longer cloudy, it was clear, almost too clear, as if it were a window rather than a reflection. And in the mirror, I saw someone standing behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I backed away from the mirror. The figure in the reflection didn't move. It was a woman, her face gaunt and expressionless, her hair hanging in matted strands. She wore a tattered dress, the fabric stained and torn. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Her lips didn't move, but I heard her voice clear as day. "You shouldn't be here." The fire in the fireplace roared suddenly, flames shooting up the chimney with a deafening roar. The room filled with smoke and heat, and I stumbled toward the front door, coughing and gasping for air. But the door wouldn't budge. The lock twisted uselessly in my hands, and the windows were sealed tight, the glass refusing to break no matter how hard I struck it. Behind me, the woman stepped out of the mirror. She moved slowly, her feet barely touching the ground, her empty eyes locked on mine. "You need to leave," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Before midnight." "I'm trying," I shouted, panic overtaking me. "What do you want from me?" She raised a hand pointing toward the fireplace. The flames had died down, revealing something hidden in the ashes, a small, blackened box. I hesitated, but the woman's gaze bore into me, compelling me to move. I reached into the fireplace, the heat searing my skin as I grabbed the box. It was heavier than I expected, the metal warped and hot to the touch. When I opened it, I found a small locket inside, its surface tarnished with age. As I held it up, the woman let out a bone-chilling scream, her form dissolving into shadows that swirled around the room before vanishing completely. The front door burst open, and I stumbled outside into the freezing night air. The town clock struck midnight, the chimes echoing through the stillness. I never told the Mortons what happened. When they returned, I left the locket on their kitchen counter and refused to go back. But sometimes, late at night, I still see her face in mirrors, watching, waiting, reminding me that I was never supposed to survive that night. The invitation arrived on Christmas morning, tucked into an unmarked envelope that had been slipped under my door. The paper was thick, the handwriting elegant and precise, as though someone had taken great care in crafting it. "You are cordially invited to the annual New Year's Eve gala at the Ravenswood estate. Formal attire required. Midnight surprises guaranteed." I almost threw it away. I didn't know anyone who lived at Ravenswood, and I wasn't much of a partygoer, but curiosity got the better of me. The estate was infamous in town, shrouded in rumors and ghost stories. People said it had been abandoned for decades, yet here was an invitation to a party there. Maybe it was a joke, or maybe someone had finally bought the place and was trying to breathe new life into it. Either way, I figured it wouldn't hurt to check it out. I arrived at Ravenswood just after 10 p.m., dressed in my best suit. The estate was massive, a sprawling Gothic mansion perched on a hill overlooking the town. Its windows were dark, and the iron gates creaked as they swung open as if welcoming me into the void. Cars lined the long driveway, and I could hear the faint hum of music as I approached the grand double doors. A man in a tailored suit greeted me, his expression unreadable. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Please, enjoy yourself. The night is full of possibilities." Inside, the mansion was stunning. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light casting a warm glow over the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. The air smelled of champagne and roses, and the music, a hauntingly beautiful waltz, seemed to float through the air. But something felt off. The guests were too perfect, their faces eerily symmetrical, their smiles a little too wide, and their eyes, they gleamed with something I couldn't quite place. Hunger, maybe, or curiosity. I tried to shake off the unease and grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. The liquid was golden, almost shimmering, and tasted like nothing I'd ever had before, sweet and sharp, with a hint of something metallic. "First time here?" a woman asked, sidling up to me. She was stunning, her emerald green dress clinging to her, like a second skin, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, how about you?" she laughed, a light tinkling sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, I've been coming here for years. It's always memorable." Before I could ask what she meant, the music stopped, and the crowd fell silent. At the top of the grand staircase stood a man dressed in a black tuxedo, his presence commanding. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his dark eyes swept over the crowd like a predator sizing up its prey. "Welcome to Ravenswood," he said, his voice booming. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the end of a year, but the beginning of a new one, a chance for rebirth, for transformation. And as always, midnight will bring its own surprises." The crowd erupted into applause, their excitement palpable. I clapped along, though I had no idea what was happening. As the night wore on, I noticed more strange things. The mirrors lining the walls didn't reflect the guests properly. Their movements lagged behind, or sometimes they didn't move at all. Shadows flitted across the room, darting just out of sight, and the guests, they weren't eating or drinking. They just stood in clusters, whispering and watching. By 11:30, I was ready to leave. Something was very wrong here, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what. But when I tried to slip out the front door, I found it locked. "Leaving so soon?" the man in the tuxedo asked, appearing out of nowhere. His smile was sharp, predatory. I'm not feeling well," I stammered. "Nonsense. The night's best moments are yet to come. Midnight is nearly upon us." He guided me back into the main hall, his grip firm and unyielding. The guests had formed a circle in the center of the room, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The clock began to chime. With each strike, the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the air growing colder. On the 12th chime, the chandeliers shattered, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights returned, the guests were gone. The room was empty, save for me and a few others, strangers who looked as confused and terrified as I felt. The grand staircase was crumbling, the once beautiful decor faded and rotten. "What's happening?" someone whispered. The man in the tuxedo appeared again, but he was different now. His face was skeletal, his eyes hollow sockets, and his grin stretched impossibly wide. "Welcome to your new year," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. "You've been chosen." Chosen for what?" I demanded, backing away. "For a second chance," he replied. "A chance to pay for the lives you've squandered." Before I could ask what he meant, the floor beneath us cracked open, revealing an endless abyss. One by one, the others were pulled into the darkness, their screams fading into nothingness. I ran, but there was nowhere to go. The walls twisted and shifted, trapping me in a maze of decaying hallways. The shadows came alive, reaching for me with cold, clawed hands. Somehow I ended up back in the main hall, where the man in the tuxedo waited. "You can't escape," he said. "The gala is eternal. And now, so are you." I woke up in my own bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, until I saw the invitation on my nightstand, the edges singed as though it had been through a fire. The clock struck midnight, and the words on the invitation shifted, the ink bleeding across the page. "You are cordially invited back. Attendance is mandatory. I haven't slept since." New Year's Eve was always uneventful in my small apartment. I usually spent it watching cheesy countdown shows and nursing a cheap bottle of champagne. This year was no different, at least, it wasn't supposed to be. The night started with a strange knock at my door. It was sharp and deliberate, 3 quick raps that echoed through my empty living room. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 8 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, no one was there. The hallway was empty, the dim overhead light flickering faintly. I stepped out and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. Just as I turned to go back inside, my foot brushed against something, a package. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with no address or name on it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I brought it inside. Sitting on my couch, I carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside was a VHS tape. I stared at it for a long moment. I didn't even own a VCR, and the sight of the outdated tape filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. Something about it felt wrong, as if it were watching me as much as I was looking at it. Against my better judgment, I decided to see what was on it. My neighbor, an older guy named Joe, had a VCR. He was always kind to me, so I figured he wouldn't mind if I borrowed it for a little while. Joe handed over the VCR without question, though he raised an eyebrow when I told him why I needed it. "Careful with those old tapes," he said. "Sometimes they hold things better left forgotten." I laughed nervously, but his words stuck with me. Back in my apartment, I hooked up the VCR and slid the tape inside. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment there was only static. Then, the picture cleared. It was a room, dimly lit and unfamiliar. The camera was stationary, facing a single chair in the center of the room. On the chair sat a man, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, staring at the camera. Or at least it felt like he would. I fast-forwarded, but nothing changed. The man remained motionless, the room silent except for the faint hum of the tape. Just as I was about to eject it, the screen cut to black. A voice crackled through the speakers, low and distorted. "Do you see him?" it asked. My heart skipped a beat. "See who?" I muttered to myself. The screen flickered again, and now the man was standing. His face was still hidden, but his posture was wrong, unnatural, as if he were a puppet held up by invisible strings. I felt a cold breeze sweep through my apartment, even though the windows were shut. The voice returned, clearer this time. "He's in your home now." The lights in my apartment flickered. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the man was gone. The chair was empty. A loud knock at my door made me jump. 3 quick raps, just like before. My hands shook as I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and that's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from inside my apartment. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. The man from the tape was standing in the corner of my living room, his face still obscured, his body swaying ever so slightly. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, pointing toward the TV. The screen showed my apartment now, the very room I was standing in, but from an angle that didn't exist, like the camera was floating somewhere above me. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. The man took a step toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural. I backed away, bumping into the wall. "Leave me alone!" I shouted. The screen flickered, and the voice returned, low and mocking. "You watched. Now you're part of it." The lights in the apartment went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled for the flashlight on my kitchen counter, but when I turned it on, the beam illuminated nothing but empty space. The man was gone. For hours, I sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight, too afraid to move. When the sun finally rose, I found the tape lying on the floor, the film unspooled and torn. I tried to tell Joe what happened, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. The landlord said Joe had moved out months ago. The VCR was gone too, and no one seemed to remember me borrowing it. I don't watch TV anymore. I've unplugged everything in my apartment that has a screen. But every so often, I still hear those 3 knocks at my door. And when I look through the peephole, the hallway is always empty. New Year's Eve was supposed to be a quiet night for me. I'd recently moved into a new apartment, a cozy little place on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. After unpacking boxes all day, I decided to reward myself with a peaceful evening and maybe a glass of wine to toast the new year. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something strange. A single black envelope had been slipped under my door. I hadn't heard anyone knock, and when I checked the hallway, it was empty. Curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it. Inside was a simple piece of black paper with gold lettering written in elegant script. "Welcome to the game. Midnight marks the beginning. Survive until dawn." I laughed nervously. It had to be a joke, right? Maybe a neighbor's idea of a prank for the new tenant. Still, something about it unsettled me. I tried to shake it off and went back to unpacking. At exactly 11:30 p.m., the power went out. The darkness was suffocating, and the silence even worse. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. My heart raced as I made my way to the fuse box in the hallway. But as I reached the door, I heard it, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps above me. I froze. My apartment was on the top floor. The footsteps didn't stop. They moved steadily, back and forth, as if someone or something was pacing directly above me. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but then I heard something else. A faint scratching sound coming from my front door. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, deliberate knock. 3 knocks. My breath caught in my throat. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, unsure of whether I wanted to open it or not. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The knocks came again, louder this time. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I unlocked the door and flung it open. The hallway was empty, just like before. I stepped out, shining my flashlight up and down the corridor. That's when I noticed it, another black envelope lying just outside my door. My hand shook as I picked it up and opened it. The message inside was simple, yet terrifying. "It's watching." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Who or what was watching? I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and went to the window, hoping to see some sign of normalcy outside. But the street below was eerily quiet, the only illumination coming from a faint glow in the distance. And then I saw it. A figure stood on the sidewalk, staring up at my window. Its face was obscured, but its posture was unnatural, its head tilted at an odd angle. As I watched, it raised a hand and waved slowly, mockingly. I stumbled back from my mind racing. What was happening? The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence as if it were right in the room with me. Midnight approached. The silence in the apartment grew heavier, oppressive. And then, just as the clock struck 12, the air around me shifted. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the apartment, followed by the sound of something scraping against the walls. I turned, shining my flashlight frantically, but there was nothing there. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, though my voice trembled. The growling grew louder, closer, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but the screen flickered and went black. The growling turned into laughter, low, cruel, and echoing from every corner of the room. And then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes emerged from the shadows, followed by a skeletal figure that seemed to glide rather than walk. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I ran to the door, fumbling with the lock, but the knob wouldn't turn. The air grew colder and the laughter intensified surrounding me. "Survive until dawn," the creature mocked, its voice echoing the words from the note. The next few hours were a blur of terror. The creature toyed with me, disappearing and reappearing in different parts of the apartment. It whispered things I couldn't understand, its voice worming its way into my mind. At one point, I hid in the closet, clutching a makeshift weapon, a metal rod I'd found while unpacking. But even there, I wasn't safe. The door creaked open, and the creature's glowing eyes stared down at me, its smile widening. "Tick-tock," it whispered. I don't know how I made it through the night. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the window, the creature vanished, leaving behind only the echo of its laughter. I found one last black envelope on the floor. "You survived this time, but the game never ends." I moved out the next day, but no matter where I go, I can still feel it watching. And every New Year's Eve, without fail, another black envelope appears under my door. New Year's Eve had always been a time of reflection for me, a quiet evening spent alone, thinking about the past year and the one to come. But this year, I decided to do something different. My friends convinced me to attend a small gathering at an old cabin deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from town. The cabin belonged to Lucas, a guy I barely knew, but everyone swore it was the perfect place to ring in the new year. "It's tradition," Lucas said when I hesitated. "The more people we have, the better." Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I didn't want to be the odd one out. We arrived just after sunset, and the cabin looked like something out of a horror movie. It was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and the only light came from a string of dim fairy lights hanging on the porch. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and pine, and an old grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner. There were 8 of us in total: Lucas, his girlfriend Amanda, my friends Jake and Sarah, and a few others I didn't know well. Lucas handed out drinks, and soon the cabin was filled with laughter and music. But as the night went on, I noticed something strange. Lucas kept glancing at the clock, his expression growing tenser as it got closer to midnight. At one point, I caught him whispering to Amanda, his voice urgent and low. She nodded, her face pale, and disappeared into another. When I asked Jake if he noticed anything odd, he shrugged it off. "Lucas is just dramatic," he said, "probably planning some over-the-top New Year's tradition." But it wasn't just Lucas. The others were acting strange, too. They avoided eye contact and stuck close to one another, their laughter sounding forced. By 11:30, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The music was off, and everyone was seated around the living room, staring at the clock as it ticked toward midnight. "What's going on?" I finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Lucas hesitated before answering. "It's just something we do every year. A game, you could say." "A game?" I repeated, my unease growing. Before he could explain, Amanda returned, carrying a small wooden box. She set it on the table in the center of the room and opened it, revealing 8 slips of paper. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Lucas cleared his throat. "Every year we draw lots. It's a tradition that's been passed down for generations. Whoever draws the marked paper has to stay outside until dawn." "What happens if you don't?" I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. Lucas didn't answer. Amanda handed out the slips, her hands trembling. "It's just a tradition," she murmured. "Nothing to be afraid of." But the fear in her eyes told a different story. Reluctantly, I unfolded my paper. It was blank. I glanced around the room, and one by one, the others revealed theirs. Sarah's slip had a dark mark in the center, a black X that seemed to bleed across the page. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not doing this." "You have to," Lucas said, his voice firm. "If you don't, it'll come for all of us." "What will come?" Jake demanded, standing up. "The Watcher," Amanda said quietly. "It comes every New Year's Eve, and it demands someone to stand outside. If no one does, it takes everyone." "This is insane," Sarah said, her voice rising. "I'm not going out there." The clock struck midnight, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. The fire in the hearth flickered and died, and a low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere outside. "It's here," Lucas said, his face pale. Suddenly, the windows rattled, and the door creaked as if something was pressing against it from the outside. The growling grew louder, accompanied by a scratching sound that set my teeth on edge. "Sarah, please," Amanda begged. "If you don't go, we're all dead." Tears streaming down her face, Sarah finally relented. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, slamming the door shut behind her. The growling stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then, we heard Sarah scream. I ran to the window, but Lucas grabbed my arm. "Don't look," he said. "You can't help her now." The screams grew fainter until they stopped altogether. "What did you do?" I yelled, shoving Lucas. "I didn't do anything," he shouted back. "This is how it's always been." The rest of the night was a blur. No one spoke. We all sat in silence, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning seeped through the windows, we finally stepped outside. Sarah was gone. There was no sign of her except for her coat, which lay neatly folded on the porch. I left the cabin that morning and never looked back. Lucas tried to explain, but I didn't care. I never spoke to him or anyone else from that night again. Every New Year's Eve, I stay inside, lock my doors, and try not to think about Sarah's screams. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear scratching at my windows, and I wonder if the watcher will ever come for me. New Year's Eve had never been my favorite holiday. Too many parties, too many drunk strangers, and too much pressure to have the perfect night. This year, I decided to do something different, something quieter. I rented a small cabin in a remote mountain town, far from the chaos of the city. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to reflect and reset. The cabin was cozy, with a crackling fireplace and big windows that overlooked the snow-covered forest. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sound was the occasional howl of the wind. It was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. The first few hours were blissfully uneventful. I curled up with a book, sipped hot cocoa, and watched the snow falling outside. Midnight was still a few hours away, and I figured I'd stay up to toast the new year with a glass of wine. But around 10 p.m., things started to feel off. It began with a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a branch against the cabin. But when I checked outside, there were no branches near the windows. I shrugged it off and went back to reading, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the front door. I froze. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. No one should have been out there. My pulse quickened as I approached the door, the floor creaking under my feet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I peeked through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. The tapping stopped. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. The porch was empty, but something caught my eye. Footprints in the snow. They led from the forest to my cabin, stopping just outside the door. The prints were strange, too long and narrow to be human. They almost looked like hooves. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly shut the door, bolted it, and grabbed the fire poker for protection. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The hours dragged on, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. The wind outside seemed to carry whispers, faint and indistinct. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering in the firelight. At 11:45, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It came from the windows, too, surrounding the cabin. Tap, tap, tap. I felt trapped, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed into the living room, clutching the fire poker, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood outside, just beyond the window. Its body was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. The sound seemed to startle the thing, and it disappeared into the shadows. But I knew it wasn't gone. The tapping grew more frantic, more aggressive, until it became a loud pounding. Bang, bang, bang. I covered my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was everywhere, coming from every wall, every door, every window. "Leave me alone," I screamed. The pounding stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, low and raspy, came from the other side of the door. "Let me in." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Number, go away." The voice laughed, a chilling, hollow sound. "You invited me," it said. "What are you talking about?" demanded my voice, cracking. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it began to whisper, a string of words I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin until they were deafening. The lights flickered and the fireplace went out, plunging the room into darkness. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rug, and hit my head on the coffee table. Stars danced in my vision as the whispers swirled around me, a chaotic cacophony of noise and dread. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. The cabin was eerily still. The only sound the soft crackle of the fireplace, which had somehow reignited. I sat up slowly, my head throbbing, and looked around. Everything seemed normal, except for the door. The wood was splintered, as if something had tried to force its way inside. I packed my things and left without looking back. As I drove down the winding mountain road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. To this day, I don't know what it was or how it found me, but every New Year's Eve, I hear that same tapping sound, no matter where I am, and I know it's waiting for me to invite it in again.